It's our talk today on different posture types, and I've got the spine here. So the biggest thing that you need to be aware of when you're trying to look at somebody's posture or change somebody's posture or alter how they move is where they are. So where are they now? And also where are they in relation to normal posture and where you want to get them to. So we'll go through the different sort of posture types, and these are obviously the main posture types and what they might present like. In terms of, is there a mix between types? Definitely. You can have somebody who is sway, who is kyphotic. You can have somebody who's sway, who's lordotic. You can have a flat back that's in sway. So, there's no one. That's it, that's that. So if you look at somebody and go, not really sure, they might be this, they might be that, the chances are they're a mix of either. The big thing is really being able to recognise where you want to get them to. So what we'll do first off is talk about normal posture. So what is good posture? What is normal posture? In terms of the spine, obviously you've got the skull, you've got your 7 vertebrae in the cervical spine, and that should have a little bit of a lordosis, so it bends in at the back. You have your thoracic spine, which is where the thoracic vertebrae take attachment with the ribs, and these are in a kyphosis, so they're a concave at the front, so it's that kyphosis, little lumpy bit at the back, and then you have the lazy S shape at the bottom where the lumbar vertebrae are in a lordosis. So the lumbar vertebra, the last one, so your last 5th vertebra, attaches onto the sacrum, so you can see with the sacrum there, your sacrum then attaches through the sides onto both sides of the hemipelvis. Okay, so there's no direct attachment from the lower to the pelvis, it's lumbar to sacrum, sacrum to pelvis. Okay, at the top you obviously have your cervical spine, you've got your atlas and your axis, and that attaches onto your skull at the top. The difference that we're looking at in terms of your vertebra and their purpose, so if we start at the base, you've got your L1 to L5, okay? The L1 to L5 is basically your lumbar vertebra numbers 1 to 5. They are big, they're chunky, they basically are doing your load and weight bearing, okay? So they take a lot of the axial forces of the body. Your thoracolumbar junction is where your lumbar vertebra change into your thoracic vertebra. So if I count these up, we've got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's the lowest lumbar. This is, highest lumbar. This is the lowest thoracic. That's your thoracolumbar junction. Okay, we've got 12 thoracic vertebra, and then you've got your cervicothoracic junction, which is where your thoracic changes into your cervical. So when we're talking physio speak, that's what we mean. So lumbar vertebra, think of them as great big weight bearing vertebra. You can see the joints, or the facet joints, are basically where the top of one joins onto the bottom of the other. Okay, so when we're mobilizing or when we're doing things, we might say L2, 3. That means, hang on a minute, 1, 2, 3, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So L2, 3 here, it's that joint between the two. So we're looking at the joint that hits between lumbar vertebra 2, lumbar vertebra 3. Obviously your thoracic sits on top of your lumbar. Your thoracic spine is where your rib cage takes attachment. So we're looking at the thoracic spine being a lot less mobile. Okay, and it's a lot less mobile because its job is to protect the vertebra, the internal organs. So you've got your rib cage that comes around, you've got all your vital things that are protected inside that rib cage. So obviously your heart, your lungs, your stomach, your liver, your kidneys, they will sit protected by the ribs. The rib cage itself obviously houses your shoulder blade and your arm and your limb, and then on top of that you've got your cervical spine. Okay, so with your cervical spine, obviously a lot smaller. They're a lot different in how their spines are situated and how their joints are angled. So if you're looking at your cervical spine, it basically has a massive amount of movement compared to your rib cage, which comparatively doesn't move as well. Okay, so specifically when we're talking rib cage movement, it obviously rotates and side bends, but in terms of flexion and extension, the pure amount in those ranges is a little bit less. So when you look at all the thoracic vertebrae and you look at how much they move, they've probably got 1, 2, 3 degrees of movement, and it's the accumulation of all of those that gives it its range. When you're looking at the lumbar and the cervical vertebra, they relatively move a lot more. Okay, so that's the difference in the thing. If you look at lumbar being the big weight-bearing joints or the big weight-bearing bodies, they're big, they're thick, they're heavy. Look at the thoracic as sitting and housing the rib cage, and that allows the protection for the vital organs. The neck obviously allows us to sit the head and rotate a little bit like a periscope on the top. All right, and that's one of the easiest ways to look at your vertebra. Okay, you've got your lazy S shape. So if I'm standing up and I'm in good posture, ideally my earlobe dissects through my shoulder, which dissects through my hips, my knee through my ankle joint, and that's my plumb line. Okay, anything that's forward or back of that plumb line is obviously going to put pressure and different things and different structures around our posture, and poor posture can put stresses and strains on the different vertebrae. So when we're talking neutral, which most of us know about, we're talking about our neutral spine relative to lumbar and pelvis, is really the optimal load, and the optimal load for loading in the lower spine and the pelvis, but it's also where the muscles are at their most effective and they're most efficient. So they're not being stressed and they're not being overused one way or another. They're working at basically their optimal load, where there's this minimum amount of stress on the tissues, on the vertebra and the joints, but there's also the minimum amount of effort required to hold them in that position. Okay, so it's this optimal loading, optimal work. And that's where we want clients to get, and that tends to be where things get a little bit more interesting. So lazy S shape is what we're after. Obviously from the front view or the back view, we're looking at a straight line. If they are skewed one way or another, then we're looking at a scoliosis, and we'll see them tipped one way or the other. Okay, so I might actually keep hold of that. And what we'll go through, because we've gone through normal posture, we'll go through variations of what normal posture can be. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to cover is a kyphosis. Okay, so with the kyphosis, basically with your normal posture here, and if I sit as upright as I can, a kyphotic posture is that. So the normal curve of the spine in the thoracic region is increased. Okay, so you'll get that sort of rounded back posture. So you can be kyphotic when you're sitting, but you can be nice and upright when you stand up. And you see that a lot with kids these days. They slump and they're here, but they stand upright and they look pretty good. So from a kyphotic posture point of view, upright, I would be here. Okay? And if you look at what's basically happening here, my distance here to stomach gets short. My distance here to here gets short because I've become rounded through the shoulders. So in terms of what we see, it is tight pecs that also then pull the shoulders forward. So we might see the shoulders that become elevated. They're also tight through the pecs. As my chest is forward here, I can't be seen to look that way, so I have to lift the head up to get my eyes correct. So instead of being nice and upright, I'm curled, but I can't, so then I do this. So what we have is flexed thoracic. We then have a shift at the thoraco-cervical junction, and then we have compression here. So what's happened is, as that slipped forward, this has to correct this way, so we bend that way. So we get what we call forward head. So we get the pokey chin and we get compression through here. So our occipitals are quite short. We get roundness through the chest, so our thoracic spine is curled. And when you then sit that on top of a neutral pelvis, it doesn't work. So what has to happen at the pelvis is we either shift that way and we tuck under, or we hinge that way. So people will either be in neutral and curled, but most of the time they'll be posteriorly tilted at the pelvis and curled. So it tends to be that question mark posture that we see. The other thing that tends to happen is obviously if we're nice and upright and we go into that cervical shift here, we're hanging off hip joints, we tend to be tucked underneath, so we lose glutes, we lose hip extension, we're tight through pecs, we're tight through our upper abs, and we also tend to have the frowning clavicles, and that's when they're using their shoulders a lot. So I'm really exaggerating here to get that thoracic posture, but that's basically it. So when we're trying to get them to stand upright and extend, it doesn't work until you sort out their pelvis first, okay? Typically these people, when they're lying, when you then lie them on their back, they might be the ones that have got the rib flare, because everything is so tight that when you lie them down it just doesn't work. So we'll go through that at another day, but that is your kyphotic posture. So your normal posture should be here, nice plumb line. Kyphotic means that they're coming into flexion. Upper abs are short, they can't look down, so their chin then comes up. Scalenes tend to be short, pecs tend to be short, they tend to use their shoulders because they haven't really got any abs holding them up. Hip flexors will also tend to be tight and they'll struggle with anything, basically prone. So when you get them on the floor, they'll be the ones that hip hitch, or they can't get flat, or they can't do anything prone extension wise. So just some things to be aware of. Obviously stretching wise, you need to be aware of the pec minor is going to be tight, as well as pec major. Okay, they're also going to be tight through their neck muscles, levator scap, all the other muscles that basically shift the shoulders up. And things like your mermaids, they're all great exercises for people who are tight through their thoracic, but the basics need to be addressed as well, otherwise you'll find you're just fighting a bit of a losing battle. So that's your kyphotic posture. Very common with your office workers these days, very common with people who spend a lot of time computer-based, or the youngsters who are sitting like this all the time. They tend to be that more kyphotic posture, and they really struggle then to extend. If you're trying to extend somebody but their abs are sore, they will struggle with deep breathing because their rib cage is very, very compressed. Very hard for them to actually expand through here because they've spent so long short. So you need to be looking at addressing upper abs as well. So a bit of a brief outline on the kyphotics. The next one we're going to talk about is sway. Your sway postures can be lordotic sway and they can be kyphotic sway. And basically what sway means is when you're standing, so that's I have to keep checking my posture in the mirror as well, but when you're standing and you've got your normal posture here, your sway means that you're just hanging. So instead of having your baseline working, what you're doing is hanging off the front of your hips. So sway just means where your midline is and your centre of balance is and your centre of gravity, you've just shifted that forward. So your hips are forward relative to your centre line, which means your top half tips backwards. Okay? When we're talking sway, that's the bit we're talking about, well that's the bit I'm talking about anyway. We're sway from the pelvis, okay? and that means that they hang off here. Weight tends to be more in the toes, tend to be just hanging off the front of the hips, and think of it as a bit like a hanging ligamentous, not using a lot of muscle work sway, because when you get them to stand up and actually use their tummy and start using some glutes or start using some activity, it gets quite tiring quite quickly and they just want to sway. What you will see is that, a drop in height, because they're hanging. Same with the kyphotics, you'll notice that drop in height. Okay, so sway means this is forward. Now, they can be sway in a posterior tilt, like that, and kyphotic, or they can be sway in a neutral and hinging. So I think we had a query about the thoracolumbar hinge. That is a thoracolumbar hinge. So my lumbar vertebra, if I go up, is about here. If I am a proper lordosis, I'm like that. My curve increases and it's actually a curve. So what's actually happening is I've increased the bend. So my spine is bent, okay? What happens with the thoracolumbar hinge is that's what I've just demonstrated in sway. Instead of being in that lordosis, I'm forward, so I'm in sway, and then to counterbalance, because otherwise I'm going to keep falling forward, I just hinge back. So the difference is a bend, or I stay in neutral, my weight's forward, and I hinge back. Okay, so what we see, if it's a true lordosis, is a curve as opposed to a bend, where it's more like that. I've got a very stiff back, so I'm probably not doing a very good job at demoing it, but it means the curvature is a C, so it looks like a nice C shape for the lordosis, or it's more angled for the thoracolumbar hinge. So with your sway postures, it can be both. Sway and flexed, sway and extended. Either way, they will still have the forward head posture, because if you're in sway and you're kyphosed, you'll get the pokey chin. And if you're in sway and you're hinged, you have to correct the chin as well. So just be aware of that you know, most of us tend to try and correct postures maybe from the top, and you look at maybe correcting it a little bit more from the base. So look at your pelvis being your keystone, and when your pelvis is in the right place, everything else has to ride on top. Very typically, what I see with the sway is that because they're here, they're very compressed. So this is my optimal way of loading. I'm in neutral. As soon as my weight goes forwards, I'm hanging off hip flexors. So hip flexors might be working, TFL might be working. I might still be short through my abs. I might use my lats to hold me up. But if I'm a kyphotic sway, I've got all the kyphotic issues that we've talked about. If I'm a hinge sway, if you see the difference, what happens is I'm then loading more, so I'm squashing that down. So as I move that pelvis forwards and hinge back, all those vertebrae, they get squashed, which is why most of those will go, oh, I just need to bend and I need to stretch. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to decompress the structures which are tight, and also they'll generally have very short, tight erector spinae, so they're long spinal muscles, and very tight QL muscles as well. Very hard for them to bend that way, and very hard for them to move that way, because the restriction of all their fascia and then their tissues are pulling them tighter. So that's a little bit about sway. Sway into kyphosis, sway into a thoracolumbar hinge, and sway into lordosis. So there can be a mix of anything. With your other posture, you can have the flat back, so that's more the military posture. And with those, if you think when they're in the military, they've lost the thoraco, so they're very straight through their thoracic spine. So you've got your normal, I'll exaggerate my normal curvature, but they're very, very straight. So think like the military backs, think very upright, think like ballet dancers where, you know, they've become very, very flat, and as you're looking at them, you've lost that neutral, or you've lost that natural curvature. So what they then are is very hard to bend forward or backwards because they tend to be very, very upright. And then what we're working towards with those is to just get a little bit more movement. So, you know, if you're thinking more the bodybuilders, very upright, very stiff, very flat, they're the ones that are probably, when people look at them, they think, God, they've got good posture. But what they are is just very, very straight, and they've lost a lot of the natural spine curve. So your aim with them is just to get a bit more mobility. And to be honest, at the end of the day, it depends whether that is a posture that is a problem for them, and whether it's painful for them, and whether, you know, they then struggle to move. So they'll struggle to move in that they'll be stiff, but it's whether that stiffness is a problem, or whether we just want them to look and move better. And at the end of the day, in terms of posture, we're always striving towards more neutral posture or more normal posture. Your ones with the flat back are probably the ones that won't curl. So if you're trying to get them to do a roll down, and it's very hard for them to curl, and it's very hard for them to curl to come up. They might actually not extend too badly. I can't remember seeing many military backs, but they will find it very hard to, they'll be the ones that are more like this, as opposed to being able to roll. Okay, so you'll probably find problematics with roll down with those. And then the other sort of more common type of posture that we see is people who've got some rotation or some scoliosis with the spine. And the scoliosis, if I turn back to you, is more where there's a curve. They might have a curve that way, and then they might have a curve to correct. They might also generally have a bit of rotation. So what you'll see is when they lean away from you, that might be higher, or you'll definitely see a bit of a twist as they move, or they might go that way, or as you're rolling down, they veer to one side. So what you're looking for is, as you look down the back and they move forward, do they move in a line, or do they veer one way? Do they have a lower lumbar, concave? So the way that, if you look at the C, the inside of the C is the concavity, so think of it as a cave, it caves in. The convexity is the outside of the curve, okay? And they'll generally have a correction higher up. So if they are scoliosed one side, they'll generally have to correct somehow at the top end, and it might even just be with the head. So you might find that they're here, and they can't stay that way, so they correct with their head. You might find that they're here, but they've got that, and then the head corrects the opposite way again. So if you're not aware, we have the head and the eyes have to be straight. It's called a head righting reaction. So what we have to do is we have to have eye level straight, and the eyes have to be forward. All right? So whatever's going on at the bottom, the top, and the eyes will correct to it. So if I'm upright here and I lift that head, or if I lift that hip, my eye line will stay. My head will tilt, but my eye line is still the same. Same this way, I'm just adjusting where I am relative, but my eye level will stay the same. The same will happen with eyes. If they're here, their eye level still stays the same. If they're here, their eye level still stays the same. If they're curled, their head will correct, but their eye line will still stay the same. So if you've got somebody that's in that scoliosis position there, and you're trying to correct that because you're thinking their head's, it's not going to happen because here's the problem. So you need to correct that bit to allow everything to move. If you've got a sway here and you're trying to bring their chest forwards, won't happen because that bit's already forwards. So my hips are forward, pelvis, thorax is behind, head's forward. I can't correct this back because I'm going to lean backwards, I can't shift this forward because my weight's forward. So what you need to correct is that bit so that everything else corrects on top. So posture is really interesting, and it's one of those things where we've all got our different ways of looking at it. We've all got our different ways of how we assess it. The biggest thing that you need to remember is that it's reproducible and repeatable for you. Okay, so we've got 3 physios that work here with me. We've got, maybe 10 different instructors. We all have a different viewpoint of what posture is. There's no real right or wrong. There is where you are and where you want to go to. And you can't get somebody with poor posture there straight away. You need to be guiding them to where you want them to be in small chunks, because telling somebody that they're here and they need to come to here, their whole centre of gravity is completely off. But what they feel is their centre of gravity is different. So their centre of gravity is different for them. So see how that works for you. We'll have another talk on posture, and we'll go into it in a bit more depth.